On the edge of the mountains, where silence ruled and the wind whispered through the pines, a reclusive man thought his isolation would protect him from the cruelty of the world. But one winter morning his solitude shattered. Hanging from the eaves of his cabin was the body of a young blonde woman, frost clinging to her lashes. The words "Apache Lover" burned deep into her skin. Who would bring such hatred here, to a place so far from the world's noise? What secrets had followed her into the wilderness, and how much danger was he now in just by finding her? Ethan had lived in the mountains for nearly a decade, far away from the noise and cruelty he had once known in the cities. A tall, rugged man with calloused hands and tired eyes, he carried the weight of battles no one else saw. After losing his wife to illness and being betrayed by the very people he once trusted, he had chosen the wilderness as his refuge. His days were simple: hunting, chopping wood, fixing his cabin, and his nights were spent by the fire, listening only to the sound of wolves echoing through the pines. But the mountains were not just a place of peace, they were also a graveyard of secrets. Ethan knew the land was still scarred by the history of settlers clashing with the Apache, a people who had been forced from their land, silenced and brutalized. He carried guilt for his family's part in that history, a truth that haunted him every time he looked out at the horizon. That morning, when he saw her, he thought at first his eyes betrayed him. A woman, pale and fragile against the cold, was tied and strung up on the edge of his cabin roof as if left for display. Blonde hair framed her frozen face, and beneath her collarbone the burned words "Apache Lover" seared the air more deeply than the fire ever could. Ethan's heart raced. This was no random act of cruelty, it was a message. Someone wanted her suffering to be seen. Someone wanted him to know exactly why she was punished. And now by finding her he had no choice but to become part of the story. Ethan rushed forward, his boots crunching against the frozen earth, and cut the woman down. She collapsed into his arms like a rag doll, her body trembling with fever and shock. Her lips were cracked, her skin blistered from fire and rope burns, and when he carried her inside she barely opened her eyes. He laid her on his bed, wrapping her in blankets and feeding her water drop by drop. Hours passed before her breathing steadied, and only then did Ethan allow himself to exhale. Yet every glance at the burned words on her chest filled him with rage. Apache Lover. The world outside his cabin had always been cruel, but this was something darker. This woman had been punished not for who she was, but for who she dared to love. As the days passed, Ethan learned fragments of her story. Her name was Clara. She had grown up in the nearby town, where whispers and hatred toward the Apache people had lingered for generations. Clara had fallen in love with an Apache man, kind, strong and gentle, and their bond was more real than any boundary of race or culture. But when the townsfolk discovered her secret, cruelty spread like wildfire. They called her a traitor, spat at her in the streets, and finally dragged her out as an example. Ethan's chest tightened as she spoke. He knew what it meant to be judged for choices others couldn't understand. His late wife had been sick for years, and people had ridiculed him for marrying a woman they called weak. But he never let go of her. Now watching Clara, he felt the same protective instinct rising again. Still, danger loomed. The men who had left Clara on his roof weren't finished. They had wanted to humiliate her, but they also wanted a message sent to anyone else who dared defy them. Ethan noticed tracks near his cabin, boot prints, cigarette butts, even a crude carving on a tree that read "Stay out." One night as Clara finally slept without trembling, Ethan sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees. Memories of his father's cruelty came rushing back. How he had once bragged about driving Apache families from their land. How he had mocked Ethan for being too soft. Ethan had left that world behind, but it was clear that hate had not died. It had only hidden, waiting for its next victim. Now Ethan faced a choice. He could turn away, let Clara recover, and send her off once she was strong enough. Or he could stand with her, risk everything, and fight the injustice that had nearly killed her. As dawn broke, Clara whispered something that sealed his decision. Her voice was faint, but her words cut through the silence. "They told me love was a crime. But if that's true, I'd rather die a criminal." Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened. For years he had lived in solitude, convincing himself the world could burn as long as he was safe. But watching Clara, he realized safety was an illusion. Hate would always find its next victim unless someone stood in its way. He rose from his chair, the fire casting shadows on the cabin walls, and stepped outside. The mountains were silent, but Ethan knew the men who left her here were close, and this time, he wasn't going to hide. The mountain morning was eerily quiet, too quiet for Ethan's liking. He had lived long enough in the wilderness to know when silence meant danger. He scanned the ridges above his cabin, and sure enough,
he spotted movement. 3 men on horseback, rifles slung over their shoulders, circling like predators. Ethan stepped back inside and found Clara sitting upright, pale but determined. She had seen them too. Fear flickered in her eyes, but behind it was something stronger. Defiance. "They won't stop," she whispered. "Not until they've destroyed me." Ethan knelt beside her, his voice steady. "Then they'll have to come through me first." The sound of hooves thundered closer. A rock shattered one of the cabin's windows, followed by a sneering voice. "Bring her out, mountain man. You think you can hide a traitor?" Clara flinched at the word, but Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He had endured years of being called weak, soft and useless, but he had never let those words define him, and he would not let them break her now. He stepped outside, rifle in hand, his frame broad against the rising sun. The 3 men dismounted, smirking with cruel confidence. One, clearly their leader, spat on the ground. "She's nothing. And you're a fool for protecting her. Apache Lover's got no place among decent folk." Ethan's eyes burned with anger. "Decent folk don't hang women on rooftops." The men sneered, spreading out to surround him. Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened, but he didn't fire. He stood his ground, daring them to make the first move. Just as tension reached its breaking point, a sound broke the standoff. Hooves, many more than 3, echoing through the valley. From the tree line emerged riders, dozens of them, Apache men and women, strong and proud, their presence a wall of silent power. The 3 tormentors froze. Their smirks evaporated, replaced by fear. The leader's voice cracked. This ain't your fight." But Ethan didn't move. Clara, now standing weakly in the doorway, spoke instead. Her voice, though fragile, carried across the clearing. "It's everyone's fight. When hate is left to rule." The men realized they were outnumbered, outmatched, not just by weapons, but by courage. Their cruelty, once so loud, shrank to nothing beneath the weight of justice. The 3 men who had come to taunt, threaten and destroy, found themselves small against the tide of riders that filled the clearing. For years they had relied on numbers, on cruelty, on the silence of others to carry out their hatred. But now the silence was broken, and the balance had shifted. They backed away, fumbling for their horses, their bravado gone. They muttered curses, empty threats, but the words fell flat. No one chased them. No one needed to. They rode off, shadows of the men they once pretended to be. Ethan lowered his rifle. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what had just happened. He turned to Clara, who leaned against the cabin's doorway, tears streaking down her face. She wasn't crying from weakness. She was crying because for the first time since that hateful night, she wasn't alone. The Apache riders dismounted, moving with quiet dignity. Their leader, an elder with hair silvered by time, nodded once toward Ethan. It wasn't just gratitude, it was recognition. Recognition that this mountain man, often mocked as a recluse, had chosen to stand with them when it mattered most. Clara collapsed into Ethan's arms, exhausted but alive, finally safe. Her scars would never fully fade, nor would the cruel memory of the words burned into her home. But now there was something stronger to hold on to, the truth that hate may shout, but love endures longer. As the riders departed, their presence left behind more than safety. They left behind proof that solidarity, across bloodlines, across prejudice, across histories twisted by hate, was possible. The cabin on the mountainside, once a lonely refuge, had become something larger, a symbol of resistance, of unity. That night, as the fire crackled inside, Ethan thought about the world beyond his mountain, a world where too many still lived in fear, where too many were still judged by their skin, their heritage, or the people they dared to love. He thought about how easy it was to stay silent, to pretend cruelty wasn't his concern, and he vowed never to stay silent again, because silence was how hate thrived. The story of Clara and Ethan was more than just survival. It was a reminder that sometimes the strongest walls are not built of logs or stone, but of courage. That standing beside the oppressed, even when the world mocks you for it, is the only way to break the cycle of cruelty. And so the question lingers. When hatred comes riding into your world, will you stay inside, or will you step into the sunlight and stand against it?